this speech today, the Queensland Government has not made a public statement about the NIIS. There is no public commitment from this government to how a NIIS will roll out in Queensland, but we are doing a lot of policy work and a lot of discussion with government in the background. But perhaps importantly, in May 2013, the then government signed a commitment, a heads of agreement with the Commonwealth, that Queensland will implement a NIIS by 1 July 2016, and if it hasn't implemented a NIIS by that date, people will be eligible to enter into the NDIS, and the Queensland Government will reimburse the NDIS for the cost of those claims. So in effect, Queensland will have a NIIS aligned through the NDIS. May not be pretty, it's certainly not perfect, and we're hoping we can address that between now and then. Just a few of the slides that I'll go over. One of the things that gets talked about a lot, the name of the NIIS, the National Injury Insurance Scheme. From a Queensland perspective, we've recently seen the South Australian rollout, and they've coined the lifetime care me care, so playing on the words of lifetime, ME, and care. New South Wales recently changed their structure of their regulator bodies, and now have insurance care, which they're now coining iCare. So we're running our little sort of names and acronyms rapidly. By the time Queensland finally gets there, what are we going to call this scheme? In terms of just a quick recap on where we've come from, and as everyone has already said, from a 2011 Productivity Commission report recommending the establishment of the NDIS and for a NIIS to sit alongside that scheme. The Productivity Commission proposed 4 streams: motor vehicle, workers' comp, medical injury and general. General pretty much being everything else that's not covered by the first 3 streams. Starting with CTP and workers' compensation, because there are existing schemes and funding bodies already in place. So in every state and territory in Australia, there is a CTP scheme, there is a workers' comp scheme. The joy of federation is that every state has a different CTP scheme. And to Roz's point, some are fault-based, some are no fault. Some are monopoly government underwritten and some are private insurer underwritten. And there are a lot of fundamental differences that spring from those structures. But the part of the reason that I think the NIIS was formed, not least of which is that one of the key architects of the NDIS had been the architect of the lifetime care scheme in New South Wales and was probably keen to see his legacy there preserved. It was easier to bring states without a NIIS up to a bar with states that already had a NIIS in place. So Victoria, Tasmania and New South Wales had NIIS equivalent schemes in place. So apart from the fact that it reduced the cost and burden on the NDIS, it built on something that existed rather than tried to take it away. The proposal is that NIIS for workers' comp CTP be in place by July 2016. And there is some policy work going on in the background on the medical and general streams, and the aim is to have those schemes established by 2019, and then the Productivity Commission come back around in 2020 and do a review of where things are at then. And then at that point, whether we expand the schemes, deepen the schemes, roll the schemes into one, all of that is ahead of us. From the approach that we're taking, not just within NIIS in how we do policy work on the NIIS, but I think also in talking to everybody else who's been associated with a NIIS outside of Queensland, there are a number of principles, notably that it's person-centred. So it is very much around looking at the scheme as it fits the need of the injured person. A lot of other schemes probably don't do that. They focus on affordability, they focus on efficiency, and the needs of the injured person are then caught up in a procedure manual, in a legislative system, whereas we're trying to build a NIIS with the person at the centre of it from day one. So as we work forward, as we start to get out of policy phase and start to get probably into a more public debate, a number of these principles will be able to sort of be elaborated on. As part of the process of bringing this into being, when you've got states, territories sitting around a table all trying to agree on something, where inevitably debate goes is to at least a minimum benchmark. So what's acceptable to everyone? It may not be pretty and it may not be perfect, but it's a start. So in the context of a NIIS, there were benchmarks set around what sort of injury is eligible for the scheme, and then what sort of coverage. So how is this thing based? So in terms of the injury, brain injury as a cohort is going to be about 60 to 70% of people who enter the NIIS on Queensland numbers as we best know them. Spinal cord injury will be about 25-30%, so pretty much you should be up to about 90-95% out of those two cohorts, and then the rest. So burns, amputations. We're going to have a smaller number of people who have got those sorts of catastrophic injury. So primarily, and I think Ros's point just before, brain injury probably will be a strong area of focus in a NIIS. But equally, there will be people who have a catastrophic injury who aren't eligible, whose injury isn't of a type that is covered by the NIIS. And I guess this is where it comes back to, it's not pretty at the start, but it starts somewhere. It's something that can evolve over time as we understand what other types of injury you would deem to be catastrophic in terms of needing lifetime care and support. The other aspect is that coverage is dictated by the CTP scheme coverage. So any farmer on an unregistered, uninsured tractor on a farm who injures themselves, kids on quad bikes, kids driving these little monkey bikes, they're not covered by the CTP scheme today, so those people aren't eligible to join a NIIS. They will be eligible to join the NDIS. So there is a scheme that will support them, but it's just not the NIIS. So when you talk about a motor vehicle accident NIIS, I think it's very important to understand that it's aligned to CTP coverage, not generically anything to do with a motor vehicle. Again, I'm not sure if this slide needs to be stated, but it's a broad coverage. It's not just about care and support. There's a whole range of other benefits that are provided by a NIIS to make sure that the person, in a sort of early intervention sense, has access to the support and the financial benefits that they need in terms of these resources. Most notably, the final one there, in terms of home modifications, the NIIS won't pay the rent, won't pay the mortgage, but it will pay for modifying a house to meet the needs of the injured person. And it's something that we are very keenly working with Heidi and her team at Griffith around. How do we make sure that we get the best housing solutions for people from a NIIS perspective? And again, I reserve that judgment on the basis that we don't yet have a NIIS publicly in Queensland, but we are working away in the background. If nothing else, it will be relevant to the CTP scheme. One of the other sort of benchmark tests for the NIIS is that coverage has to be based on a reasonable and necessary system of entitlement. Reasonable and necessary is a subjective term in the eyes of the beholder. So what I think is reasonable and necessary is probably different to what somebody else thinks. Having care and support delivered in Paris may be very important to someone and might be deemed reasonable. Certainly from another person's perspective it might not. Aside from trying to design a system that hopefully sets some guidelines and principles that inform people as to what is covered and what isn't, it's also then going to be a question around funding, affordability, cost. So at the end of the day, the needs and or interests of the motorist who is funding a NIIS balance up against the needs and interests of an injured person who is seeking benefits and coverage from the NIIS. So a whole discussion to be had there. And certainly one of the areas we're looking at right now is around the arbiter of this. Will it be a medical panel or will it be a legal panel? And depending who you talk to, what profession they come from, the answers are very clear cut. But the end result will be, in any legislative process, it will be what it is. So it's something that we're very conscious of. It's something we're looking at how we design for, but as yet we don't know what the outcome will look like or will be. Just in case it helps the discussion, just sort of done a couple of slides here, just contrasting the NIIS against the NDIS and then the NIIS against CTP. As was already mentioned, the NIIS is a federated scheme across all states and territories. It's owned by the states, it's financially underwritten by the states. The NDIS is a Commonwealth system underwritten or managed federally. In terms of providing reasonable and necessary care and support versus providing in terms of the NDIS benefit structure, early intervention is one of the key differences. So people who have a disability in the NDIS receiving an ongoing benefit versus someone who is unexpectedly injured and finds themselves with a catastrophic injury. I think the benefits of early intervention are well known to so many people and are probably one of the key reasons why the NIIS does have this priority focus around how can you help improve outcomes, not by just simply saying, here is your weekly care and support entitlement, but being very active and early in terms of what can be done to improve that person's situation now that they have suddenly found themselves in this post-injury environment. The question of full funding. In a NIIS, we will be looking at how do you cost the lifetime cost of all injuries that will arise during a year and charge, whether it's government or motorists, a fee, a levy, or a charge against consolidated revenue that meets the cost of those people for the rest of their lives. In an NDIS environment, money is just found out of consolidated revenue to meet the cost of people in the scheme for that particular year. So it just rolls on. Every year you're going to find $18–20 billion for the NDIS, whatever the number grows to be by the time the full scheme's operating. In a NIIS environment, future generations shouldn't be required to meet the cost of people who are injured in this particular year, because it should already have funds set aside to meet those costs. I guess that's where an important insurance principle comes into play and why both schemes have the word insurance in them, around looking at how to try and understand what the costs are, understand where you best intervene to manage those costs, and then how you can look at the long-term and life-term effect of those interventions around how you might be bringing that cost down. So the federated schemes will undoubtedly undertake some benchmarking, look to compare how different schemes are operating, different interventions, how they're working, and then ideally you would like to think there would be a sort of community of best practice emerge, and through collaboration, whether it's through research, whether it's through claims management practice, everyone can improve and deliver better outcomes for people in the scheme and for people who are funding the scheme. The NIIS will only cover people who are injured from the date the legislation commences. The NDIS is going to cover people with a disability regardless of the date of onset. So in Queensland, I think there are 93,000 people who've been identified as being eligible for the NDIS. As I understand it, there's going to be a 3-year rollout of the scheme. So whether it's going to be 1/3 at a time or geographically, you'll see a different rollout and a different sort of number of people who come into the NDIS, but vastly different numbers, vastly different geographic challenges. Again, when you're talking in this sense, 140 people a year versus 93,000, you can't compare the two schemes in so many ways, but we will need to interact across both of those schemes. If you then take that comparison back to the existing CTP scheme, 140 people eligible for NIIS, that's the, I guess, an average number. I mean, actuaries work with numbers and they like to average numbers. We're working on the assumption that there will be 140 people a year, 70 who currently have a CTP claim and 70 who don't. Some of that's come from historical Queensland Trauma Registry data. Some of it's come from CTP scheme data, and also looking at interstate schemes to understand how many people come into the scheme from within a compensation environment and from a non-compensable environment. On any given year, the number will be above or below 140, but the long term, it should average to that number. The CTP scheme generates around about 6,500 injury claims a year. So when the lawyers sort of talk to us about the effect of the NIIS on the CTP scheme, we try to bring it back to, at the end of the day, the NIIS is only affecting the common law rights of 70 people. It's hardly wrecking the CTP scheme, it's hardly changing the world in that broader scheme, yet it is so important to the people who will be in the NIIS environment. When you look at the mind-boggling numbers that the actuaries are coming up with, the average life of a NIIS claim around about 40 years. Current CTP claim average life is about 4 years from the date of accident to the date the claim's finalised. Some run longer and some are shorter, it depends when they're settled. But again, we've got a scheme which will be sort of 10 times the duration of the existing CTP scheme. The decisions that are made in claims management have sort of a magnifier effect of whatever you do in 1 year magnifies out on an average 40 times compared to 4. So some of the decisions we make in a NIIS context will be far more significant than they would in a CTP scheme. One of the other figures not up there is that our actuaries have commented that we'll need 100 years before we can truly judge the performance of a NIIS. I mean, how many? We think lifetimes, governments think electoral cycles. That's 33 electoral cycles away. The NIIS on sort of our costings around about $340 million a year. The CTP scheme currently collects about $1.3 billion of premium a year. So you would say, oh, the CTP scheme, bigger on cost, bigger on numbers, it's gigantic. But because the NIIS is based around a lifetime care and support scheme, within 10 years, the number of participants in the NIIS will be up over the 1,000 mark, but the assets and the liabilities that the NIIS have accrued by that stage will be well over $1 billion and growing. I mean, 40-year average life, this thing is going to grow decade on decade for a long time. Within 10 years, the NIIS will dwarf the CTP scheme in terms of its financial size. And by that stage, I would anticipate it will also dwarf the thinking and the urgency around where effort is needed, where time and focus is needed. You go to the bigger scheme. So the NIIS might start small, but it grows, and within 10 years, it will be big enough to be commanding its own sort of agenda and its own concerns, let alone what's happening in the NDIS world by that stage. Again, because we don't have a public policy, this is just some conceptual conversation around what we might do if a NIIS was coming to Queensland. All of this work is actually happening, and MAIS has got people working on pretty much each one of these streams in anticipation of a NIIS possibly arriving in Queensland. If it turns out that we are left holding the NIIS in terms of implementing it, because nobody else puts their hand up and wants to take it off us, then all of this work will be of benefit to us. If it turns out the government decides somebody else should be managing the NIIS, well, so be it. We hope all of this will inform them and support them in their thinking about how they might bring a NIIS about. Currently, we are heavily focused on the first dot point, the policy work. Informing a new government, which was only elected this year, has come in with its own priorities and its own sort of urgent need to address what it committed to in the election. And I think, in fairness, we understand about new governments forming, new ministries forming, new staff coming in behind those ministers. Things take a bit of time to get settled. The NIIS has sort of now got into the mindset and the conscience of this government in terms of we've had a number of briefings, a number of conversations around what it is, what we see it requires and involves. We're waiting now to see how we can get through a government sort of agenda, if you like, around when we can get going with it. All the other streams of work underpin what needs to happen, not least of which is this is a greenfield site. So the governance of the NIIS, how it will operate. We've been out at PA Hospital talking to Tim Geraghty around what's going to happen on day one when the first person comes into the hospital and I say, are you a CTP or are you a workers' compensation person? I go, no, I'm neither. And everyone goes, well, what do we do? Is there a claim form we fill out? Is there a procedure manual we need to follow? I mean, all of this is ahead of us, but it's very real, practical stuff we've got to address. Legislation has to let us collect a levy. Legislation has to let us actually make decisions around paying claims. So who has the delegated authority to actually make payments? Again, what's the, if you like, the command and control of decision making? So we would like to think we would have a smooth, sophisticated system that just springs into life on day one, but it clearly won't be that way. We're all going to have to work very closely with so many people on how we get this scheme operational. Back in the office in terms of our IT systems, all of our financial controls, sort of back of office stuff is never exciting, it's never sexy, but it's all essential. So we've got a team, again, working on how this might operate. And I've got a couple of slides a bit later on in more detail on that. And I think more importantly, and probably Something which we've struggled with how we're going to address this is the communication and awareness of a NIS. And it's sort of slipped under the radar, if you like, of public consciousness. People talk about the NDIS, very few people talk about the NIS, probably because in some states it existed already. It's not called the NIS anywhere. It's a lifetime care and support scheme, it's the TAC scheme, it's the Motor Accident Insurance Board scheme in Tasmania. Nobody calls it the NIS. So the fact that WA and Queensland were the last states, and WA has come on board and announced its scheme will start from 1 July 16. We're waiting to see what they call their scheme, but it won't be NIS. I think that's probably where a lot of the communications have sort of hit a void. We've got to work out how we address that. So how we get sort of the broad understanding of what the NIS is alongside the CTP scheme that it exists already, but I think there is a very strong or high apathy level around CTP. You pay it as part of your registration cost. 4 million motor vehicles in Queensland, 6,500 claims a year, very little utilisation by most people in the public. And then when they do come into the system, it's foreign to them. They only come through it once. So a whole lot of communication around how these schemes work, it will probably fall on deaf ears. People won't want to know about the NIS until they suddenly need it. So that's one of the challenges we're wrestling with at the moment. Somebody sat down with a spreadsheet and started toting up the names of who we need to talk to when we go out to consult on the NIS. Got over 110 names pretty much quickly. And you look at it and go, that's not possible. But you start to think about, from whether it's the insurance industry, whether it's in the health field, whether we're talking to the AMA, whether we're talking to each of the HHSs, talking to ABIOS. You come through, and even the Taxi Council want to have a say about the NIS because they want to understand how taxis are going to be operating in terms of ferrying people around. RSCQ, so many bodies who want to have a say and will be interested in the NIS. Then we've got I should be careful how I say this, important people we need to talk to, Spinal Injury Association, Synapse. We need to understand people who are working in the system with people who currently would be eligible for a NIS to understand how service continuums work, where the failings are, what do we need to make sure we get right if a NIS is going to become operational. So, and across these different groups, some of them stand to benefit in a NIS environment. So, how attendant care services operate is clearly going to be seen as sort of in a beneficial light. It's a positive opportunity. The financial planning sector sees the NIS as a threat. They lose 70 lump sum settlements that ordinarily they'd be able to charge fees for in terms of helping people plan how they invest their lump sum for the rest of their lives. Now, all of these people have to have their interests taken into account. And we need to make sure government is aware of all of these interests so that you don't have this sort of naive notion of the NIS is all wonderful and everyone's going to be supportive of it and benefited from it. There clearly are going to be some stakeholders who don't see the NIS in the same light as everybody else, and we've got to make sure we manage that process. So we've got sort of a plan, if you like, around how we will engage with the different stakeholder groups and the intensity of how that engagement will occur. One of the principles that we're going to adopt in how we plan for the operations of a NIS is using a framework called customer-based design. And having come from an operation or a company that used this, I've seen the benefit of what happens when you think about the customer, when you're designing your system, you're designing your procedures. So, we're currently going through what the consultants like to call the voice of intent. So, what is it that you're trying to do here? Then you move on to talking about the voice of the consumer. So, who's actually benefiting from the scheme? Then we'll have the voice of interest in terms of what are the stakeholder groups, who do we need to talk to, who will have an influence in how we shape the NIS, and then how do we bring all of this down so that 140 people a year who have a person-centred regime built around them. Clearly, you don't want to have a procedure manual that says there is one way and only one way that the NIS will work. Equally, you can't have 140 procedure manuals that evolve as each person comes into the system and you go, all right, you're from this age group in this geographic region with this particular injury. It just wouldn't work. So we're hoping that we can design a framework that is adaptable and flexible to the needs of people who come through the NIIS, informs all stakeholders around what's, if you like, a care plan, how will it work, how different stakeholder groups and service providers interact, so that as efficiently as possible we can build a system that will work and make for a successful NIIS. And I guess in talking through the relevance of why customer-based design, because it is about personalised care and it's person-centred, because it's a greenfield site, so we're building something fresh, we're building something new, we don't have anything existing in place to build on. And finally, about the cultural change. How do we effect a successful NIIS implementation? Within the Insurance Commission, we use an IT system we've just rolled out across a number of our claims units, business process management enabled, so it's not a traditional transaction system. We're looking to build a case management regime for the NIIS, which accommodates how each claim will manage in terms of the flow of what will happen on the claim. The portal will let all of the different stakeholders have a view of what's happening on that claim to the degree that information mustn't be sort of retained privately. But hopefully what will enable out of this system is that when you've got a hospital setting and you've got a personal sort of care regime at home, there is interaction about the transition. So people can see what's happening with the movement between service providers, movement across sort of geographies, and that you build up a history. So that not only can we see what's happening on each individual claim, but we can see more broadly what's starting to take shape in terms of what's working well, where is the process starting to either fall down, or where is it running extremely smoothly, and then we can build and adapt from there. Inevitably, someone will want to know all about the reporting, whether it's in terms of scheme benchmarking comparison, or whether it's just within the state, just understanding what's going on. So again, there's a whole lot of work going on currently around understanding what are the sorts of fields of data we want to capture for a NIIS. It's not the traditional, two cars collided, vehicle one is at fault, here are the injuries, here's the heads of damage, here's the amount of compensation to be paid. Very different sort of system that will be structured and very different sorts of reports that will be generated. And I guess inherent in all of that is that if we're not innovative, if we're not looking to keep improving from wherever we start, we don't want day one to be sort of seen as, right, rolled out, launched, that's it. It's got to be a framework that builds upon itself. So I guess the key thing for us is point one, we've got to keep working on how we shape the policy work for a NIIS, how we bring about successful implementation. July 16 is a fixed date in terms of the financial liabilities arising and people being eligible for coverage. It would be fantastic if we have a scheme in place on that day, and so we have a nice sort of good launch, and sadly, hopefully we don't have to sort of have someone arrive on day one in this scheme. It would be nice to think that we can go without a serious injury in Queensland for some time, but reality is we have to be prepared for 1 July 16, that someone may arrive in a hospital who needs coverage by the NIIS. Keep working on the design. We'll be coming out talking to a lot of key stakeholders around how we might design a system in anticipation of that start. The whole governance of how we're going to build this thing. I think there's going to be a day one model that we're going to advocate for, which is a lean arrangement, builds on the existing resource in the Insurance Commission, rather than create a whole new statutory body with its own board and own sort of structures. That's a possibility. Government may decide to go that way, but just given the slow build in terms of the number of people coming into the system, I think we can also do a slow build in terms of the infrastructure. And we've got the 2019 and 2020 windows when the NIIS broadens into the other streams, that there is an opportunity to have a couple of bites at this thing in terms of a legislative framework. So we'll see how that goes. The communications piece, keep working on how we talk to the key stakeholders and then talk to the general public around what the NIIS is, and then ultimately if a levy has to be charged, what does that levy look like, how much is that levy, and how do you work with people around the benefits. The simplistic line might be, this is a federal reform, it's already been signed up to by the previous government, and the sorts of costs we're talking about here are pretty much around about $1 a week for motorists in Queensland. So it's not the most expensive scheme in the world, but it's at the end of the day we have a government that as part of its election mandate was no new taxes and charges, and I don't think anyone, you can be as cynical as you like around $1 a week. Fundamentally, when a government comes in saying we will not have any new taxes and charges, you have to be cognizant to that's the reality that they're working in, that's their political lens, and as a bureaucrat you have to understand that's what we're working with. So we'll be looking at all the different ways that we can structure this thing and make it work, looking for a successful launch, and look, it may land with us, it may not, but hopefully all the work we're doing right now at least benefits another entity if it goes somewhere else, but I haven't heard of anybody else silly enough to put their hand up for it just yet. Thank you.